Racist officer targets black man. He's the incoming chief of police. The morning air in East Ridge was thick with the quiet hum of a city preparing for another day. Early sunlight glinted off the windows of tired brick buildings, casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalks below. Police cruisers lined the street outside Precinct 9, engines off, radios crackling softly with static and half-formed chatter. Inside the station, the buzz of routine police work filled the air. Paperwork rustled, phones rang, and tired officers discussed their third cups of coffee. Outside, leaning against a street lamp just a few paces from the precinct's front steps, stood a tall black man dressed in a dark charcoal suit. His shoes were shined, his posture relaxed, and his eyes calmly scanned the street, taking in the details with quiet observation. He checked his watch. 7:42 a.m. He was early, intentionally. Down the block, Officer Daniel Crowley had just stepped out of his cruiser. With 15 years on the force, Crowley carried himself like a man who believed the city belonged to him. He was broad-shouldered and tight-jawed, with sharp blue eyes that didn't hide their judgment. His uniform was spotless, his badge glinting like a warning light, and his every step echoed authority. He had seen the man near the precinct while pulling into the lot, and something about the guy's presence rubbed him the wrong way. Crowley wasn't the type to let anything unfamiliar slide without challenge. "Hey!" Crowley called out as he crossed the sidewalk, his boots clapping hard against the concrete. The man in the suit didn't flinch, just turned his head slowly in Crowley's direction, unfazed. "Can I help you with something, sir?" the man asked, his voice even, respectful. Crowley didn't like the tone. It was too calm, too self-assured. He stepped closer, squinting at the man like he was a puzzle piece that didn't fit. "You're just standing around out here. This is a police facility. You got business here, or are you just loitering?" The man straightened slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his otherwise composed face. "I have a meeting scheduled," he replied simply. Crowley scoffed, stepping into the man's space. "You got a name, some ID?" The man's jaw tightened slightly. "Do you ask every person walking past the building for ID?" Crowley's tone sharpened. "No. Just the ones standing around like they're casing the place." "And what exactly do you think I'm planning?" The man replied, his eyes now holding Crowley's with a flicker of restrained challenge. Crowley didn't like that one bit. "You think this is a game, tough guy? I don't care how slick that suit is. You don't get to mouth off to me. I asked for your ID. Now," the man paused. He seemed to be making a decision, weighing something. Then, deliberately, he reached into the inside pocket of his blazer. Crowley tensed immediately and instinctively rested his hand on the grip of his service weapon. "Easy," Crowley growled. "Slow." The man looked at him unimpressed. "It's a business card," he said flatly, and then slowly drew it out. Crowley snatched the card, gave it a cursory glance, and chuckled. "This is a joke, right? Anthony Andrews, no title, no department, no phone number." "It's not a joke," Andrews replied, his tone still even. "It's a temporary card. I just moved back." "Yeah, well, we don't do anonymous visitors here," Crowley snapped, pocketing the card without permission. "You need to wait somewhere else. This isn't a public bench." Andrews stared at him, the trace of a frown appearing. "I said I have a meeting here. At 8 a.m. I arrived early to observe the precinct before stepping inside. I don't need permission to stand on a public sidewalk." Crowley stepped even closer, now barely a foot away. "I said move it. Now." Silence stretched between them. Other officers passed by on the steps behind Crowley, giving the scene side glances but not interfering. This was Crowley's jurisdiction, and most knew better than to cross him. Or, at least, that was the belief until today. Crowley's eyes narrowed. "You trying to start something?" Andrews didn't flinch. "No, but I don't respond well to threats." Crowley's hand moved again. This time not to his weapon but to something worse. Without warning, without words, he leaned forward and spat, a glob of contempt landing squarely on Andrews' suit lapel. Andrews' face turned to stone. The surrounding air seemed to freeze. An older black woman walking by across the street stopped in shock, eyes wide with disbelief. A young rookie officer at the station entrance turned his head, saw the aftermath, and froze like a deer in headlights. Crowley straightened up, eyes blazing with misplaced pride. "Now you're gonna get moving, or you'll get more than a dirty suit. You understand?" Andrews slowly reached into his blazer again, not for a card this time, but a handkerchief. He wiped the spit away, staring directly at Crowley as he did. The cloth came away damp, stained, and symbolic of something much larger than just disrespect. Crowley looked smug, his chest puffed like he'd just put a dog in its place. But he didn't notice the pair of footsteps coming up behind him fast. "Officer Crowley!" barked a voice. "What the hell is going on?" It was Captain Ruiz, red-faced and breathless. He pushed between the two men, looked at Andrews, and immediately paled. "Oh my God," Rees said, voice trembling. "Chief Andrews, I am so sorry. I had no idea you were already here." Crowley's expression twisted. "Wait, Chief, what?" Ruiz turned on him, eyes wide with fury. "This is Anthony Andrews. The man you just assaulted. He's the new chief of police for East Ridge. He was your boss before you even opened your damn mouth." The silence was deafening. Crowley's bravado collapsed in real time, the blood draining from his face. Andrews didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply looked at Crowley, that same unreadable calm masking a sea of emotion underneath. "Captain Ruiz," he said, finally breaking the silence. "Please escort Officer Crowley inside. I'll join you in the briefing room shortly." Ruiz nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. Absolutely." Crowley stood frozen for a moment, disbelief washing over him like a tidal wave. He looked back at Andrews, hoping for a word of mercy, maybe an explanation. He found none. As Ruiz led Crowley away, the officers on the steps parted like the Red Sea. No one said a word, but they all watched. And they understood. Andrews remained outside for a moment longer. He turned and looked up at the precinct building, the morning sun now fully washing its brick walls in golden light. It had been years since he walked into a police station as a superior. Years since he'd left the city he once loved because of the rot inside its justice system. But this morning, he had returned. Not to serve, but to change everything. And it had already begun. The door to the East Ridge Police Precinct groaned on its hinges as it shut behind Officer Crowley and Captain Ruiz. The cool blast of the station's overworked air conditioning was a stark contrast to the rising heat outside. But even that chill couldn't suppress the tension radiating through the room. Ruiz led Crowley toward the administrative wing, his steps quick and full of barely contained rage. Crowley followed silently, each step heavier than the last. He felt like he was walking toward a guillotine. "Sit," Ruiz snapped, pointing to a bench near the Internal Affairs office. "Don't move. Don't say a damn word." Crowley sat, stiff and red-faced. His ears still rang with Ruiz's voice shouting, "Chief." He kept replaying the moment in his head, the business card, the suit, the calm tone. How could he have missed the signs? But deeper than the embarrassment, beneath the confusion and dawning realization, was something uglier. Him. Crowley thought. They made him chief. Ruiz stormed off, leaving Crowley to stew in silence. Back outside, Chief Anthony Andrews lingered for another minute, taking a few deep breaths before entering the precinct. He dabbed the last trace of saliva from his lapel with his now crumpled handkerchief and slid it back into his pocket. His expression was composed, but inside, his thoughts swirled like a storm. He hadn't expected a warm welcome, not in this city, not in this department. But still, that moment with Officer Crowley had crystallized something for him. East Ridge hadn't changed. Not yet. He pushed the door open and stepped into the precinct. Heads turned as he walked in. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A few officers stood straighter, unsure whether to salute or avert their gaze. Chief Andrews met their eyes without flinching. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady and low. "I'll be in the briefing room in 5 minutes. I expect the full command staff and shift leads present. No exceptions." No one argued. He disappeared down the hallway, each step echoing authority. In the briefing room, the air was thick with unease. Sergeant Lena Mathers sat with her arms crossed, glancing warily toward the door. Lieutenant Banks, a longtime insider and one of the few black officers with rank, sat at the far end, his face unreadable. Others milled about quietly, exchanging uncertain looks. When Chief Andrews entered, the room went silent. He walked to the front, placed a file folder on the lectern, and looked up. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, "I want to make something clear from the outset. I didn't come here to smile and pose for photo ops. I didn't come here to slap wrists or offer second chances to people who've made careers out of disrespect and abuse. I came here to change this department. Fundamentally, permanently." A shift rippled through the room. Some officers stiffened. Others looked down. He continued. "Many of you know my background. I started in this very city 25 years ago, in uniform, walking beats you now patrol. I left after I realized this department had no interest in protecting everyone equally. I spent the next 2 decades with the FBI, civil rights investigations, anti-corruption units, internal affairs oversight, and now I'm back." He let the words sink in, then opened the folder. "My first official act this morning was being spit on by one of my officers. Before I could introduce myself. Before I said a word." Murmurs rose in the room. A few officers looked genuinely shocked, others less so. "I won't name the officer. Not today. But what I will say is this. What happened this morning isn't an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a disease." He looked around the room slowly, making eye contact with each person. "That disease is entitlement without accountability. It is culture without conscience. It is bias, racial, cultural, economic, dressed up as gut instinct. And it ends now. He flipped to the next page. Effective immediately. All body cam footage will be reviewed randomly twice a week by an independent oversight committee. Any use of force incidents will require written justification reviewed by 3 separate supervisors. All civilian complaints will now be responded to within 48 hours. With or without internal resolution. A few officers shifted in their seats. The air was growing tighter. I know some of you think you're doing things the way they've always been done. That's part of the problem. Always got us where we are now. Mistrusted, watched, hated in the communities we're supposed to serve. He leaned forward slightly. But some of you. You've been waiting for this moment. You've seen the rot. You've kept your heads down, hoping someone would step in and say enough. Well, I'm that someone. And I'm not going anywhere. A beat passed. Dismissed. Command staff, stay behind. The rest of the room filtered out, more quietly than they had entered. Crowley, still seated outside in the hallway, watched them with growing unease. No one looked at him. No one needed to. Back inside the command meeting, the mood remained tense. Sergeant Mathers spoke first. Sir, I don't condone what happened this morning. But I'll be honest. There's going to be pushback. Officers feel like they're being judged before they've even had a chance to prove themselves to you. Chief Andrews nodded. They are. Because the public judges us every single day. And they don't get the luxury of hiding behind the badge. Lieutenant Banks leaned in. Chief, there's a lot of history here. Some of these guys are set in their ways. Crowley especially, he's been untouchable under the last 3 chiefs. Protected by the Union. The city, even the old DA. None of that matters anymore. Andrews replied. And Crowley, he's under formal review starting today. IA is already pulling his personnel file, including past complaints. We'll follow procedure, but thoroughly. I'm not here to create martyrs. I'm here to make examples. He paused. Starting with him. Leader that day, Chief Andrews sat alone in his new office. The walls were still bare. The furniture was generic and cold. But he wasn't here for DA Corps. He pulled out a legal pad and jotted down note. Training overhaul, community board meetings, promotion pipeline review, recruitment from local HBCUs. His pen stopped. He thought of the look in Crowley's eyes. That cocktail of disbelief, resentment, and fear. In traffic stops. In old locker rooms. In cases he worked in Detroit and Atlanta. And always, it came from the same place. Fear that power was being taken away, but it wasn't. Not really. The goal was never to strip power. It was to redefine it. To redirect it. Away from ego. Toward service. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock. It was Officer Naomi Vega, young, bright-eyed and nervous. Chief, she said, stepping in. I saw what happened this morning. I wanted to say, I'm glad you're here. We've needed someone like you for a long time. Andrews smiled, the first genuine smile of the day. Thank you, Officer Vega. That means more than you know. She nodded and turned to leave. Vega, he added before she left. How long have you been here? 2 years, sir. You ever seen Crowley pull that kind of thing before? She hesitated. Not quite like that. But I've seen how he talks to people, civilians, especially black men, like they're threats. Like they're already guilty. Andrews leaned back in his chair, expression tightening. Thank you. That's all I need to know for now. When she left, he closed his notebook and stared out the window at the city below. This was only the beginning. Meanwhile, in the locker room, Crowley sat alone on a bench. His badge had been turned in for the review, his sidearm placed in a sealed locker. His name was already starting to fade from hallway conversations, replaced by the sound of a new name echoing through the halls. Chief Anthony Andrews. Crowley pulled out his phone and opened a search engine. He typed in, Anthony Andrews FBI, and hit enter. The results stared back at him, dozens of articles. Decorated civil rights investigator, advisor on DOJ police reform initiatives. Key testimony in 3 high-profile police corruption trials. Architect of community-led policing models in Atlanta and Baltimore. Crowley felt something twist in his chest. Not guilt, not really. Something more primal, fear, and for the first time in a long time Daniel Crowley realized he wasn't the one holding power anymore. For most officers in East Ridge, Monday mornings began with the same routine roll call, briefing, coffee in battered thermoses, maybe a quiet joke or two. But not this Monday. This morning, the precinct buzzed like a hive kicked by a steel toe boot. Everyone had heard. Some had seen it with their own eyes. And those who hadn't were now poring over the footage. Shaky smartphone clips, body cam previews, security feeds. It was already making the rounds on encrypted message boards, and private group chats. Crowley spit on a black man. The black man turned out to be the new chief. The irony was too sharp to ignore. For some it was pure shock. For others it was long overdue justice. For Crowley, it was the beginning of his fall from grace. He'd spent most of the night at home, silent and boiling. The union rep had already contacted him and offered support. Though it was clear even the union wasn't sure how much they could do this time. There was video, witnesses, a public complaint pending, and a new chief with federal backing. Now at 8:05 a.m., Crowley sat stiffly in his parked cruiser outside the station, staring through the windshield like it might shield him from the inevitable. He had been summoned back. Not to resume duty, but for something worse. Administrative leave, publicly. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. It didn't matter that he'd given 15 years to this department. Didn't matter that he'd trained half the officers inside. It didn't even matter that just last year, he'd been named Officer of the Quarter by the previous chief. None of that mattered now, because the man he'd humiliated, the man he'd spit on, was now sitting in the office above him with the full authority of the badge and the title Chief of Police. Crowley exhaled slowly and opened the door. Inside the precinct lobby, all eyes turned as the heavy door swung open. Crowley entered in full uniform. He walked with the same stiff gait as always, chest out, jaw set. But something had changed. The usual nods and "mornin's" were gone. The younger officers looked away. The older ones offered nothing. It was a silence heavier than any insult. Sergeant Mathers watched from the corner of the lobby with a cold, hard gaze. She didn't greet him, didn't even acknowledge him beyond the glance. "Crowley," came a voice. It was Deputy Chief Harland. A by, the book type whose years in the department had been marked by neutrality and procedural obsession. He stood near the elevator, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a flat line. "You're to report to Conference Room B. Chief Andrews is waiting." Crowley gave a curt nod, suppressing the venom in his throat. He took the long hallway toward the rear of the building. Officers stepped aside, not out of respect, but like pedestrians dodging roadkill. He passed the operations board. His name was already gone. Conference Room B was plain, just 4 beige walls, a laminate table, and a few stackable chairs. But this morning, it might as well have been a courtroom. Chief Andrews stood at the window, looking out over the precinct parking lot. He didn't turn around when Crowley entered. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice calm and distant. "Close the door behind you." The Crowley obeyed. Andrews turned. His suit was clean tailored. His hands were folded neatly in front of him. There was no rage on his face, just resolve. "You understand why you're here," he said. Crowley nodded once. "I've placed you on administrative leave effective immediately, pending an investigation into your conduct during your interaction with me. Body camera footage has been submitted. Several witnesses have already given statements. You will be contacted by Internal Affairs within 48 hours. Crowley shifted in place. "With all due respect, Chief, I didn't know who you were." Andrews raised an eyebrow. "And that justifies spitting on someone." A pause. Crowley flinched. "I didn't know who you were," he repeated, but softer this time. "That's exactly the problem," Andrews said. "You saw a black man standing outside the precinct, and you assumed the worst. You escalated without cause. You tried to intimidate, and when that didn't work, you chose disrespect. Violent disrespect." Andrews leaned forward slightly. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone you've treated that way. Without cameras. Without witnesses. This time you didn't get away with it." Crowley's jaw tightened. "You've already made up your mind." "No. I haven't," Andrews said, his voice firm. "But the evidence will, and so will the public." He picked up a folder from the table and slid it across. "These are your complaints. 27 over the last 6 years. Excessive force, racially charged language, improper conduct. Most of them were dismissed or buried. You know why?" Crowley didn't answer. "Because no one wanted to deal with the fallout. Because previous leadership lacked spine. Because people like you knew how to play the system." He stepped back. "But I'm not playing." Silence stretched again. "You're free to speak with the union, hire representation, do whatever you feel necessary. But until the investigation concludes, you are suspended without badge, without weapon, and without access to internal systems. If you're seen inside this precinct again without permission, you'll be removed." Crowley stood there, still as stone. Andrews gave a final nod. "You can go." The hallway outside felt longer on the return walk. When Crowley emerged back into the lobby, the quiet had grown louder. 2 young officers whispered behind the front desk. One of them, Officer Vega, didn't even try to hide her disapproval. Crowley kept his eyes straight ahead. But the weight of the stairs crushed his posture. His badge handed in. His gun, already locked away. His name, whispered like a curse. He passed the line of recruits in the training wing. New blood, watching the fall of a former legend. The walk of shame was complete. Outside, the air was thick and humid. A single news van had arrived, too early for the full story, but right on time to catch a disgraced officer exiting the building in silence. A microphone was raised, but Crowley didn't answer. He climbed into his cruiser and drove away, not fast, not slow, just gone. Back inside, Chief Andrews sat alone in the command conference room. The encounter had gone exactly as expected. There was no apology, no understanding, only excuses and indignation. But he hadn't come for apologies. He came for change. His phone buzzed. It was a message from the mayor. "Let me know when you're ready for the press briefing." Suze responded simply, 1 p.m. today. "I'll speak." He turned to the window again. Outside, the city moved on, buses, pedestrians, children heading to school. For them, justice wasn't a press conference or a disciplinary hearing. Justice was safety, fairness, dignity. And that's what he intended to deliver. Not just once. At precisely 1 p.m. Chief Andrews stood behind the podium outside City Hall. Flanked by the mayor, city council members, and representatives from the Civilian Review Board, he faced a wall of microphones and cameras. The crowd gathered quickly. Media activists, skeptical community members, even a few off-duty officers. He cleared his throat and began. This morning, Officer Daniel Crowley was placed on administrative leave following a disciplinary review. His conduct was unacceptable and in direct violation of the ethical standards we uphold. He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. But this moment is not just about one officer. It's about a culture that has gone unchecked for too long. A culture where accountability is rare and privilege is abused. That changes now. He outlined the reform measures being implemented: increased oversight, independent auditing, expanded training in de-escalation and cultural competency, a recruitment overhaul, civilian participation in disciplinary hearings. This department belongs to the people, Andrews concluded, and it will serve the people, all the people, regardless of race, income, background, or belief. Applause broke out. Not overwhelming, not universal, but solid. Hopeful. In the back row of the crowd, Officer Vega clapped quietly, her expression proud. And on a rooftop across the street, an old protester who'd once marched against this same department leaned forward and whispered, "About damn time." Meanwhile, across town, in a modest bar with cheap beer and quieter corners, Crowley sat alone with a drink in his hand and a long silence stretched before him. His phone buzzed again. It was a message from an old buddy from the force. "They're talking about firing you. Whole city's watching. Careful what you say next." Crowley stared at it, then set the phone down. Because deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't being fired for a mistake. He was being held accountable for a pattern. And this time, he couldn't outrun the consequences. It was already viral by midday, but by 7 p.m. the headline dominated every major local station, had made it to regional news cycles, and was climbing national social media trends like a rocket. White officer spits on black man, then learns he's the new police chief. The headline was too sharp, too poetic in its karmic symmetry to ignore. Cable news pundits picked it apart from every angle. Talk radio was ablaze with rage and debate. YouTube channels were splicing the body cam footage with commentary overlays and red circles pointing at Crowley's expression when he realized who he had disrespected. By midnight, it was clear this wasn't going away. The city of East Ridge had become a symbol. Whether of long, overdue justice, systemic failure, or institutional hypocrisy depended on who was speaking. But one thing was undeniable: everyone was speaking. In East Ridge itself, reactions varied like the heat patterns on a summer sidewalk. Some people cheered. Literal cheers rang out in the neighborhoods that had endured over-policing for decades. In the McPherson district, on the steps of St. Anthony's Baptist Church, a group of mothers, most of whom had lost sons, nephews, or brothers to the justice system, held a small, impromptu vigil. There were no candles or signs, just a circle of folding chairs, paper fans waving in the thick night air, and quiet murmurs of "finally." Down on Lorimer Avenue, where Crowley had once patrolled with an iron grip and a short fuse, the atmosphere was jubilant. At Darnell's barbershop, the usual evening chatter erupted into full-on debate. "He got what he deserved," Darnell said, running clippers through a teenager's fade. "But don't let it fool you," replied Marcus, an old head who always sat in the corner playing chess with no opponent. "One snake loses its head, two more show up. This ain't the end, it's a beginning." A test. There was nodding. Agreement. Not celebration, but recognition. A chapter had turned, but the book was still thick with old blood and older rules. Elsewhere, the backlash brewed. Within the police department, Crowley still had his defenders. Mostly quiet, mostly white, but undeniably present. Some whispered that the punishment was political, overblown. Others said privately that Crowley had just been doing his job. That anyone standing unannounced outside a secure entrance was asking for attention. But the mood had shifted. Fear and uncertainty settled over the department like morning fog. No one could say it aloud, but the message was clear: business as usual was over. In the locker rooms, senior officers began watching their language. The casual slurs, the racially tinged jokes, the offhand references to suspects as them. They weren't gone, but they were quieter. At roll call the next morning, Chief Andrews did something few chiefs had done before. He spoke to every shift, personally. He didn't preach. He didn't scold. He just stood in front of each group, looked them in the eyes, and said, "We're changing. If that bothers you, the door's right there." No one walked out, but several looked like they wanted to. The union issued a tepid statement. "We await the results of the investigation into Officer Crowley's conduct, and remind the public that all individuals are entitled to due process." They didn't mention Andrews by name. They didn't offer support either. Public pressure continued to mount. Civil rights groups called for a full internal audit. Protesters began to gather outside City Hall, not in the thousands, but in enough numbers to send a message. "We saw it. We won't forget it. What are you going to do next?" Andrews knew that sentiment well. He'd grown up in a city not unlike East Ridge, had marched in his first protest before he'd grown facial hair. His appointment hadn't come by accident. It came on the back of years of quiet, grueling work in federal investigations, policy overhauls, and community outreach. He'd turned down 3 other chief offers before this one. But East Ridge had called to him. Not because it was easy. Because it was broken. And maybe, just maybe, it was ready to be fixed. By the 3rd day, national news trucks rolled into town. MSNBC did a live segment from outside the precinct. Fox News ran an op-ed calling Andrews a woke activist in a uniform. CNN tried to book him for a Sunday morning interview. He declined. He didn't want to be famous. He wanted results. In private, he met with community leaders, reverends, barbershop owners, teachers, small business owners. Anyone whose name was trusted in neighborhoods most officers only entered with backup. They didn't hold back. "Your badge don't mean jack to us until we see real change," said Miss Tompkins, who'd run the Grace Center for over 2 decades. "Don't smile at cameras. Show up when it's ugly." He promised he would. He also met with internal review teams, reassigned 2 lieutenants, and made it mandatory for all supervisory staff to attend a new training series led by outside equity consultants. "We have to learn how to police with the community, not on it," he told them. "Some of you may not like that. You're still welcome to leave." Some did. 2 officers resigned within the week. Both had been named in old excessive force reports. Neither made a statement. Meanwhile, Crowley went silent. He avoided the press. His phone went dark. His lawyer issued a boilerplate denial of wrongdoing and insisted he was being scapegoated in a climate of hysteria. But inside, Crowley felt it. The world he'd known was slipping away. Old allies stopped calling. Former colleagues kept their distance. A few diehard supporters tried to start a GoFundMe for his defense fund. It flopped, only raised $700. At night, he watched the footage again. Not because he wanted to, because he couldn't stop. He watched himself barking orders at a man he didn't recognize. Saw his own lip curl in contempt. Saw the spit fly from his mouth. Saw the moment Andrews turned and said, "That's funny, I am." It haunted him, not because he regretted it, but because he'd lost. Not just his job, his certainty, his power. On the 7th day, Chief Andrews held a town hall meeting at the East Ridge Community Center. He didn't wear his badge or a formal suit. Just slacks and a dark polo. He brought no entourage, no press. Just a microphone and a folding chair. The room was packed. Black elders, white retirees, Muslim teens, Latino parents, activists, even a few officers in plain clothes. He opened simply, "I'm here to listen. Ask me anything." And they did. For 2 hours the questions came. What are you doing about racist officers? How will you protect protesters if they march? Why should we trust you? What will you do when the next Crowley shows up? He answered every one. No deflection. Accountability is the start, not the end. Protest is a right. I'll defend it. You shouldn't trust me blindly. Watch what I do. If another Crowley appears, I'll remove him faster than the last. By the end of the night, the crowd wasn't clapping. But they weren't walking out either. That was enough, for now. Back at the precinct, a younger officer named Jalen Ross watched the live stream of the town hall from the break room. He was 27, second year on the force, and one of the only black patrolmen in the city. He smiled quietly, watching Andrews handle the heat with grace. Maybe, just maybe, things were shifting. When Andrews returned to the station later that night, he found a note taped to his office door. No name. Just a simple message in block letters. Done stop. He didn't intend to. Chief Andrews knew early on that the worst resistance didn't come with raised fists or shouted words. It came in whispers. In subtle nods. In silence during meetings. In policy memos that were accidentally delayed. In missing signatures. In the smirk of an officer who followed his orders on paper but not in spirit. The old guard had survived for decades by outlasting reformers and outweighting scandals. They didn't need to fight Andrews in the open. They simply needed to slow him down. But Andrews wasn't here to play politics. He was here to clean house. And the house, he was learning, was dirtier than anyone admitted. The department had over 220 sworn officers. About 60% of them had been on the force longer than 10 years. Nearly all of those had worked under Chief Pelham, a good old boy leader who'd protected his officers like family and swept their sins under threadbare rugs. Pelham had retired quietly, for health reasons, just before the last election. Rumor was that he'd left behind a safe full of sealed complaints and a hard drive of body cam footage that never saw daylight. Andrews had requested both on day one. He found the safe empty, the hard drive missing. What he did find were statistics, years of disproportionate stops, arrests, and use of force reports heavily skewed against East Ridge's black and Latino populations. Patterns so obvious they didn't need charts, just honesty. He called his first command staff meeting to address it. It didn't go well. They sat around the long rectangular table, starched uniforms and blank faces. The command staff included 6 captains, 3 assistant chiefs, a union liaison, and the city's police legal advisor. They were mostly white, mostly male, mostly tight-lipped. Andrews stood, sleeves rolled up, no PowerPoint, no handouts. "I'm not interested in preserving culture," he began. "I'm interested in preserving lives." Some eyes narrowed. He held up a sheet of years. "We've had over 800 use of force incidents. 79% involved black individuals. Black people make up just 31% of this city." Silence. "And if we want to pretend that's because black residents commit more crime, I've got the arrest logs to disprove that too." Still nothing. Then Captain Leland spoke. Leland was the longest-serving officer in the room, 27 years in, a square-jawed, steel-eyed relic of old-school policing. "Sir," he said carefully, "you're citing numbers, but numbers don't always tell the full story. Our officers respond where the crime is. That's not racism, that's reality." Andrews didn't flinch. "The reality," he said slowly, "is that some of your officers, including Officer Crowley, have abused their authority without consequence. And the city is done looking the other way." Leland stiffened. Crowley had years of commendations. Crowley had years of complaints. And most of them were dismissed. Andrews stepped closer. "And why do you think that is, Captain?" Leland said nothing, but his silence said everything. By week's end, Andrews had reassigned 3 captains. 2 were put on administrative review. 1, Captain Felder, a man infamous for turning body cams off mid-incident, was quietly pushed into early retirement. The department's whisper network erupted into a storm. "You hear what he did to Felder. They say he's building a case file on everyone. Next thing you know, we'll need permission to breathe." Some officers, the ones tired of the rot, quietly welcomed the shake-up. But they didn't say it aloud. Not yet. It wasn't safe. Not until Andrews made it safe. Enter Officer Jalen Ross. Ross was a beat cop, second year in, usually patrolling the Martin Luther King corridor. He was smart, clean-recorded, ambitious, but cautious. He hadn't spoken up during the initial fallout of the Crowley incident. But he'd been watching. And now, he stepped forward. He requested a private meeting with Andrews. "I'm not trying to make a name for myself," Ross said as he sat in the chief's office. "But I can help." Andrews studied him. "How?" "I know who's pushing back. I hear them. The locker room talk, the refusals to cooperate. Some of them are organizing a walkout. If you want change, you'll need people inside. People like me." Andrews nodded slowly. "Then you're on the new community response unit," he said. "You'll help draft policy, review footage, speak at the next training seminar." Ross blinked. "Me? That fast?" "Someone has to lead the new blood," Andrews said. "And I don't have time to wait for volunteers." Ross sat straighter. "Yes, sir." Andrews smiled for the first time that day. Resistance deepened elsewhere. Flyers appeared in the parking lot. "Oh, licen not politesse." An anonymous email circulated claiming Andrews was bringing BLM into law enforcement. A few right-wing blogs ran hit pieces accusing him of race baiting and department destabilization. One night, someone scratched the word "TRITAR" into the hood of his cruiser. He didn't flinch. Instead, he held a press conference the next day announcing a series of sweeping changes. All field officers would undergo quarterly de-escalation training. Complaints would no longer be reviewed solely by internal command. A civilian-led oversight panel would now have full access to files. Anonymous tip lines would be established for officers to report abuse, with whistleblower protections built in. All stops and use of force encounters would be randomly audited by independent reviewers. Reporters blinked. Andrews smiled slightly. "This isn't reform," he said. "This is realignment." Inside the department, tensions came to a head at the next union meeting. Sergeant Mathers, the same officer who'd gone cold on Crowley in the lobby, now stood to speak. "I've watched too many good officers get dragged down by bad ones," she said to the gathered room. "We complain about how the public treats us. Maybe we should ask why." An older officer in the back scoffed. "Don't start that bad apples crap," he muttered. Mathers turned to him. "You know what they say about bad apples, right? They spoil the bunch." She stared around the room. "I'm not letting my name be spoiled anymore." The room was silent. For the first time, the old guard looked vulnerable. Then came the biggest surprise of all. Officer Crowley requested a hearing. Legally he had the right. The union pushed for it, believing a private hearing might salvage his pension or buy him time to pivot. But Andrews insisted the hearing be public. And so, a panel of 3 review board members, 1 city representative and 1 outside legal counsel convened to evaluate the evidence and allow Crowley to speak. The room was packed. Camera crews hovered outside. Protesters flanked the street. Crowley, pale and thin from weeks of seclusion, took the stand in his pressed uniform. He spoke haltingly, offering half regrets and self-pity more than remorse. "I didn't know who he was," he said again. The board chair replied, "Why should that matter?" The Crowley had no answer. The review board deliberated for 2 hours. Verdict: termination, with prejudice. No reinstatement eligibility. Crowley's jaw clenched as the room erupted in applause outside. Andrews stood at the back silent. Not smiling, just steady. Later that night, Andrews sat alone in his office. The building was quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the windows. On his desk sat a new file. It was from Ross. Inside were names, officers who had complained in secret, others who wanted transfers out of toxic units, requests for new policies, a list of recruits from the academy who wanted to help with community outreach. Andrews exhaled. The old guard wasn't gone. But the new blood, it was waking up, and he intended to give it a future. The file came in an unmarked envelope. No return address, no stamp. Just slid under the door of Chief Andrews' office sometime between dusk and dawn. He found it lying quietly on the rug beneath his desk, sealed with a piece of plain Scotch tape. He closed the door behind him, sat down and opened it. Inside, 50 pages of personnel complaints, many of them against senior officers. Most were stamped, resolved, or dismissed, in heavy black ink. Several included notes. No video available. Witness uncooperative. Officer's word upheld. But one thing caught Andrews' attention immediately. Crowley's name appeared 11 times. Only 3 of those entries were part of the official file he'd received on his first day as chief. The others had been buried. Some went back 8 years. Excessive force. Verbal abuse. Retaliation against complainants. One even alleged that Crowley once struck a teenager with the butt of his service pistol after a foot pursuit. No arrest followed. No charges filed. And yet, no punishment, either. At the bottom of each report was the same signature: Captain Philip Leland. Andrews leaned back in his chair. He hadn't trusted Leland from the start. Now he knew why. By 9:00 a.m. Andrews was on the move. He summoned Internal Affairs, specifically Lieutenant Maria Singh, the only IA officer he trusted to keep her mouth shut and her files airtight. They met in a conference room with no windows, no cameras, no recordings. He dropped the manila folder on the table. "These are real," Singh said after 10 minutes of review. "None of them are in the official archive. This would have taken multiple approvals to bury." Andrews nodded. "Start with Leland. And anyone who touched these. Are you thinking? Internal conspiracy, at the very least, administrative fraud. If we're lucky, we find enough for criminal charges." Singh whistled low. "This could blow the department wide open." "That's the idea." Over the next week, Singh and her team combed the archives. What they found was worse than either of them expected. Over a dozen officers had been protected from disciplinary action under Pelham's tenure. Files had been lost. Witnesses never contacted. Body cam footage either missing or labeled inconclusive. In several cases, civilian complainants had mysteriously withdrawn after speaking with officers off record. And the same names kept surfacing: Captain Leland, Deputy Chief Harrow, and a civilian liaison named Grant Jeffers. Pelham's longtime fixer, now a quietly retired consultant still drawing a city pension. Andrews decided it was time to call in the outside cavalry. He contacted the state attorney general's office and requested a formal investigation into East Ridge PD's internal affairs practices under the previous leadership. The request sent shockwaves through City Hall. Mayor Langston, who had appointed Andrews, called him that afternoon. "You sure about this?" "Devon. More sure than anything else since I took this job." You'll be digging up a lot of bones, some of them political. I'm not here to protect anyone's legacy. Langston sighed. You have my support. But if this gets ugly, it's already ugly. I'm just turning on the lights. While the investigation began gathering momentum, the department began to fracture. Officers who had once stood side by side now eyed each other with suspicion. Was he one of the protected? Was she one of the informants? Old loyalties cracked. Some tried to distance themselves from the rot they'd once quietly tolerated. Others doubled down, closing ranks, grumbling about witch hunts and cancel culture. At the center of the storm, Captain Leland maintained his usual icy calm. He hadn't been formally accused. Not yet, and he wasn't stupid. He knew what was coming, so he made the first move. Leland called a press conference. Flanked by his lawyer and several union representatives, he delivered a carefully worded statement. Recent events have cast unjust suspicion on honorable officers who have served this city for decades. He said, while I welcome any fair investigation, I will not be made a scapegoat for political ambitions masquerading as reform. He ended with a veiled jab. Chief Andrews may believe in turning over stones. But he should be careful. Some of us know what's underneath. It was both a threat and a warning. Andrews didn't flinch. He issued no response. Instead, he issued subpoenas. The Attorney General's investigators moved in swiftly. They set up shop in City Hall, began reviewing records, interviewing former complainants, and seizing department hard drives. Their questions were sharp and direct. Why wasn't this file submitted? Who signed off on the dismissal? Did you ever feel pressured not to report misconduct? And for the first time in years, people began to talk. One retired officer confessed that Pelham held discretionary sessions, private, undocumented meetings where misconduct cases were discussed and quietly dismissed if the officer was considered good man. Another officer admitted that footage of one violent arrest had been intentionally mislabeled in the archives to keep it from being pulled for review. I didn't want to lose my job, he said. Everyone knew it was wrong, but what were we supposed to do? In the middle of this firestorm, Andrews received a message from an unexpected source. Janice Crowley, the mother of Officer Crowley, she requested a private meeting. When she arrived at Andrews' office, she was not the person he expected. Dressed modestly, with silver hair and a steady voice, she looked nothing like the angry families of fallen officers or the defensive parents of disgraced cops. I raised my son better than this, she said quietly, settling into a chair. But I also know where he learned to hate. Andrews said nothing, waiting. I worked at the department too, she said. Civilian HR. For almost 15 years. I saw things. I ignored things. I kept quiet. She pulled out a thumb drive. This is the backup archive. I saved it when I retired. I knew someday someone would need it. Andrews took the drive slowly. Why now? She looked him in the eyes. Because I don't want his hate to live longer than me. The drive contained over 200 deleted files, old complaints, internal memos, unedited incident reports. Some implicated officers still active. Others pointed to systemic fraud in how statistics were reported to federal monitors. Downplaying racial profiling, overreporting successful interventions. But the biggest find was a confidential memo from Pelham to senior staff titled Shielding Protocol, Maintaining Morale in the Ranks. It was a blueprint for burying misconduct. Flag problematic complaints as low priority. Do not escalate without supervisory approval, if necessary. Reframe complaints as communication errors. Maintain officer confidence by shielding from politically motivated accusations. Pelham had signed it himself. It was dated 7 years prior. The revelation detonated across media outlets like a bomb. News stations broke into programming with the headline, Leaked Documents Reveal Systemic Cover, up at East Ridge Police Department. Pelham, now retired in Florida, issued a terse denial. I did what I had to do to keep the department functioning. The city council called an emergency session. Civil rights groups held marches outside City Hall. Protesters carried signs reading, beneath the badge, there's blood. Justice doesn't expire. This is not just about Crowley. Andrews stayed out of the spotlight. He had work to do. Back at the station, young officers like Ross and Mathers doubled down. They formed a peer review board of their own, began drafting reforms to internal policies, created mentorship programs for new recruits. They were tired of wearing a badge that made people cross the street. This isn't just cleanup. Ross said at a precinct meeting. It's reconstruction. Not everyone agreed. Several older officers resigned, citing political hostility. But for everyone that left, 2 young officers stepped forward. They didn't want silence anymore. They wanted integrity. One evening, as Andrews prepared to leave, he walked the halls of the precinct alone. He passed the old portraits of past chiefs. their stoic faces staring out from dusty frames. He stopped in front of Pelham's. The plaque beneath read, Chief Harold Pelham, 1997-2021 Service, Tradition, Brotherhood. He stared at it for a long time, then turned and walked away. The past wasn't gone, but it was no longer untouchable. East Ridge was quiet on the morning of the hearing. Not peaceful, quiet. The kind of silence that follows a storm when the damage is still being assessed, when people step outside their homes and stare at the wreckage, unsure what to say. The city had changed, slowly, painfully, and not yet completely. But something had shifted. For the first time in decades, the East Ridge Police Department was about to be held accountable, publicly. And the man leading that charge, Chief Devin Andrews, stood before a packed courtroom as the Attorney General's office began formal hearings into systemic misconduct. This wasn't just a trial of policies or protocols. This was a reckoning of values, a peeling back of the curtain on a department that had worn honor on its sleeve and hid rot beneath its armor. Andrews took his seat beside the city's legal representative, his face unreadable, his posture calm. He had learned to hold his expression like a shield. Not just for his sake, but for everyone who had come forward because of him. For Ross, for Singh, for the young black cadets, who now dared to dream of wearing the badge, without betraying themselves. Today wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. The hearings began with testimony from the Attorney General's lead investigator, a woman named Meera Patel, who read aloud from the recovered documents. She quoted Pelham's secret, shielding protocol, the one that instructed officers to reinterpret use of force reports to maintain morale. She detailed the missing footage logs, the altered timestamps, the suspiciously consistent use of the phrase, non-compliant but non-violent, in reports involving minority residents. She named names: Captain Leland, Deputy Chief Harrow, Officer Connors, Sergeant Franks, and yes, Officer Thomas Crowley. Each mention drew murmurs from the crowd. Some gasped, others sat stone-faced, anger curdled into silence. When she finished, she turned to the panel and said, "This was not a failure of a few. It was a conspiracy of many, and it was sanctioned from the top down." The next witness was Janice Crowley. She came without makeup, her eyes heavy, her shoulders hunched, but her voice steady. "I worked there for years," she said. "And every time I saw a complaint get thrown out without review, every time I saw a kid's name scratched off a report, I told myself it wasn't my job to interfere." She paused, her lip trembling. "And then one day, my son came home talking about how he'd put some punk in his place. I asked if he meant a suspect. He said, 'Nah, just a loudmouth.' I laughed with him. I laughed." The courtroom was silent. "I taught him to be proud. I thought that meant protecting his shield. Now I realize I should have taught him how to protect his soul." When she stepped down, she did so without applause. There was nothing triumphant in her testimony. Only sorrow. Captain Leland refused to testify. He invoked the Fifth Amendment for every question. "Captain Leland, were you aware that Officer Crowley had multiple use of force complaints sealed under your command? On the advice of counsel, I declined to answer. Were you instructed by Chief Pelham to suppress internal investigations? I declined to answer." But even silence speaks volumes. The panel noted his refusal, then turned to the man they were most interested in, Chief Andrews. He took the stand with no notes, no counsel, and no hesitation. "Mr. Andrews," began the chairwoman of the hearing panel, "since taking office, you've filed more disciplinary reviews than your 3 predecessors combined. Is that accurate?" "It is. You've publicly criticized the department's history. Some say you've damaged its credibility." "I disagree," Andrews said. "I've revealed the damage that was already there. Ignoring a fire doesn't extinguish it. It just lets it burn longer." She leaned forward. "What does justice look like to you?" Andrews paused. "It looks like accountability," he said. "Not for the sake of vengeance, but to restore faith. The badge isn't just metal, it's a promise. And when that promise is broken, people don't forget. They fear. They run. Or worse, they fight." He scanned the room. "And I don't want the next black boy stopped by one of our officers to wonder if he's about to be protected. Or punished." There was no applause. Just a stillness that settled over the room like prayer. The panel adjourned for review. The findings came 3 days later. A citywide reform order was issued. Captain Leland and Deputy Chief Harrow were terminated with immediate effect. Criminal investigations into obstruction and civil rights violations were underway. Former Chief Pelham's pension was frozen pending further review. 10 other officers were placed under internal review, and at least 4 of them were recommended for dismissal. The department would undergo federal oversight for 3 years. All IA investigations would be monitored by an independent, third-party ethics panel. But perhaps most importantly, Chief Devin Andrews was confirmed by unanimous vote to continue leading the East Ridge Police Department. He had faced death threats, protesters on both sides, and betrayal from within, and he had endured. In the weeks that followed, the department began to shift, quietly, then gradually and finally, publicly. Ross's community policing unit received full funding and expanded into 3 districts. He was promoted to sergeant. Mathers became head of internal affairs, replacing a retiring supervisor who admitted she should have left years ago. Lieutenant Singh was elevated to deputy chief, making her the first South Asian woman in department history to hold the rank. Andrews, in one of his first acts after the hearing, ordered a wall in the main precinct cleared. Gone were the dusty portraits of old chiefs. In their place he installed a mural, commissioned by a local artist designed with community input. It depicted 3 figures, a child holding a toy police car, a mother reaching toward her son, and an officer kneeling, not in submission but in solidarity. Above them were the words, to serve, to protect, to be worthy. But transformation came with a cost. The department lost over 24 officers in early retirements, resignations, and disciplinary action. Some local business leaders accused Andrews of politicizing law enforcement. The police union, though quieter now, still issued periodic statements criticizing outside interference. And there were days when Andrews sat alone in his office, staring at case files and wondering if any of it would hold after he left. That's when Ross knocked. "Got a minute, Chief?" Andrews looked up. "Always." Ross stepped in, holding a slim binder. "Final draft of the Academy overhaul. We're adding required coursework in cultural competency, civilian engagement, and legal accountability. Also mandatory ride-alongs with EMTs and community response teams." Andrews flipped through the pages. "This is good," he said. "This is real good." Ross smiled, then hesitated. "You think we're making a difference?" Andrews leaned back. "I think we're building a foundation," he said. "We may not see the whole building, but someone will." Ross nodded. As he turned to leave, Andrews stopped him. "Jalen. Yeah. You ever think about being chief someday?" Ross blinked. "Me?" Andrews smiled faintly. "Why not?" Ross chuckled. "I'll start by learning how to stomach a courtroom." Andrews laughed for the first time in weeks. Late that night, Andrews stood outside the precinct, looking up at the stars over East Ridge. He wasn't naive. There would be more fights, more headlines, maybe even another Crowley, someday. But not without resistance. Not without someone standing up. He thought of his father. How he used to sit on the porch after long shifts, never talking much, just listening to the crickets and the faraway hum of police radios. He thought of that boy Crowley spat on in the lobby. The one who stood up, not with fists, but with truth. He thought of what it meant to wear the badge, not as armor, but as a burden. To carry it with humility. To carry it with fire. And to never, ever let it fall. Late that night, Chief Devon Andrews stood outside the East Ridge Police Department, the mural glowing softly behind him. The street was quiet. The chaos had passed, but the real work, the rebuilding, had only just begun. He looked up at the stars, hands in his pockets, the weight of the badge pressing lightly against his chest. Not heavy. Not light. Just real, a symbol of both the burden and the promise he now carried. In the windows behind him, young officers met with mentors, trainees studied new policy manuals, and civilians sat beside officers in community panels. Talking, not shouting. He thought of Crowley, of Pelham, of every victim whose complaint was buried, whose voice was silenced. Of Ross, Singh Mathers, and his late father who once told him, "Wearing the badge doesn't make you brave. Living up to it does." Devon Andrews hadn't just survived the storm, he had become its clearing sky. A new chapter for East Ridge had begun. And maybe, just maybe, it could finally become the city its people deserved. Moral of the story: power reveals character, but accountability reveals justice. True leadership isn't about authority, it's about courage, compassion, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, even within your own ranks. Racial bias, abuse of power, and institutional silence don't disappear on their own. They're undone by people brave enough to break the cycle. This story reminds us that change often starts with one person refusing to look away, and that a badge should never shield injustice. It should be a promise to protect everyone equally.